Deep in the swamps of rural Louisiana, hidden from the eyes of the world, stood a crumbling wooden house that locals only whispered about. The Bowmont property was a place men avoided, a place that felt cursed even in daylight. When authorities finally stepped past its rusted gate in the summer of 1976, what they uncovered would shake the entire state. Inside, 17 people lived in suffocating silence. Children with hollow stares, twisted bones, and hauntingly identical faces. A father who believed the outside world was poisoned, who thought his bloodline needed to be protected, and a family tree so tightly knotted it had become a cage. This isn't just a crime story. It's a generational tragedy. One that forces us to ask, how far can isolation bend the human mind before it finally snaps? If you're fascinated by true stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature, stick around. This one is unlike anything you've heard before. Make sure you hit like, tap subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves real-life mysteries. You won't want to miss the chilling details we're about to uncover together. The swamp lay silent that July morning, heavy with mist, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Authorities approached cautiously, boots sinking into the mud, every step amplifying the sense of foreboding that hung over the place. The Bowmont property rose from the wetland like an abandoned outpost. A sagging wooden fence circled the land, its planks warped by decades of rain. Beyond it stood the house, gray and skeletal, watching them like a ghost. Deputy Henry Reynolds led the way, sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. He had handled countless calls in rural Louisiana, but nothing about this one felt ordinary. Something deep inside told him this was different. The complaint had been brief. A hunter claiming to have seen too many children in one place, all looking sickly, almost unnatural. It sounded strange enough to warrant investigation, even for this county. When Reynolds reached the gate, he paused. The stillness of the property was unnerving. Not a dog barked, not a bird stirred. It felt as if nature itself had abandoned this patch of land years ago. He pushed the gate open, its rusted hinges screaming against the silence. As the men stepped inside, the ground seemed to swallow sound. They advanced toward the porch, boots leaving shallow prints in the wet earth. The house loomed closer, its windows dark, their glass clouded with grime. Reynolds knocked once, no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. After a long pause, the door creaked open, and a figure appeared. Jason Bowmont stood framed in the doorway, his hair gray and unkempt, his face lined like the weathered boards of his house. He looked at the men with suspicion, his eyes narrowing as if bracing for intrusion. Reynolds introduced himself, explaining they were responding to a welfare complaint. Jason hesitated, then stepped aside without a word, allowing them inside. The air in the house was damp and stale, smelling of mildew and wood smoke. What they saw next froze them in place. The main room was crowded with figures, children silent and watchful, staring at the newcomers as though from another world. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin and fragile. Some had obvious deformities, fingers fused together, spines bent unnaturally. Others had faces so similar they looked almost like reflections of one another, unsettling in their uniformity. Reynolds felt his stomach tighten as he counted heads. 17 people in total filled that room. Jason stood apart from them, his expression unreadable. When Reynolds asked who they were, Jason's reply was flat, almost casual. "They're mine." The weight of those words hit like thunder. Reynolds's gaze shifted to the oldest youth standing near the back, his head lowered. His features resembled Jason's so strongly it was impossible not to see the connection. This was no ordinary household. Something darker was hidden here. As the deputies moved deeper into the house, they saw more evidence of neglect. The floorboards were warped, the roof leaked in several spots, and the few pieces of furniture looked decades old, patched with nails and rope. In one corner, a crib fashioned from scrap wood held a baby who barely stirred at the intrusion. His breathing was shallow, his limbs stiff. Reynolds felt an ache in his chest. This wasn't just poverty, this was isolation taken too far. The kitchen revealed little food. A pot of thin broth simmering on a rusty stove, a few jars of preserves, sacks of grain. It was barely enough to feed one man, let alone a house full of children. Everywhere the air was thick with silence. None of the children spoke, even when asked questions. They simply stared, eyes wide, as if words were a luxury they had never been taught to use. Outside, the swamp buzzed faintly with insects. But inside the house there was no sound except the creak of boots and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Reynolds knew he had to call for backup. Whatever was happening here was far beyond a simple welfare check. He stepped outside to radio in, the oppressive weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. As he waited for a response, he looked back at the house. Jason stood in the doorway, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to question his authority. Behind him, the children remained motionless, still as statues. Help arrived within the hour, more deputies and a social worker coming to assist. They approached cautiously, their expressions hardening as they saw the state of the property for themselves. The decision was clear. The children had to be removed. Jason resisted at first, his voice rising, his face contorting with anger. But when he saw the sheer number of men now standing against him, his defiance faltered. He stepped aside, muttering under his breath. The process was slow, methodical. Each child was led outside into the humid air, their bare feet sinking into the mud. Some cried softly, others simply stared, unblinking, as if they had never seen the open sky before. Reynolds watched as the youngest were carried into waiting vehicles. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something more than a rescue. This felt like the end of a long, hidden chapter in history. The house, once full of stifled breathing, now felt empty. The deputies searched every room, finding little beyond broken furniture, old tools, and stacks of notebooks filled with Jason's handwriting, rambling passages about purity and bloodlines. When Jason was finally handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car, he did not resist further. He only stared ahead, silent, as if convinced that what had happened was inevitable. His house stood behind him, sagging in defeat. As the convoy of vehicles wound its way back through the swamp, Reynolds glanced one last time at the property. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the house in stark daylight. It looked smaller now, as though stripped of its secrets. Back in town, word spread quickly about what had been found. Locals gathered in the sheriff's office, murmuring in disbelief. Many had suspected something was wrong out there, but none had imagined anything this severe. The social workers worked through the night, cataloging the children's conditions, arranging medical transport, and taking statements. Every discovery seemed to paint a darker picture of life on the Bowmont farm. Doctors from Lafayette were called in, their faces grim as they conducted examinations. Malnutrition, genetic defects, untreated illnesses. It was like stepping back into another century, a place untouched by modern medicine or care. As reports piled up, one fact became clear. This was not an accident of circumstance. This was the result of deliberate isolation, a way of life that had been passed down through generations, tightening like a noose around the family. Reynolds sat alone on the station porch at dawn, staring out over the quiet street. The sun was rising, burning away the last traces of swamp fog, but inside, he felt only the cold shadow of what he had witnessed. He knew this was only the beginning. Investigators, reporters, and scientists would soon descend on the case, eager to understand how something so extreme could have gone unnoticed for so long. The Bowmont house would never again be just another lonely home in the swamp. It had become something else, a symbol of what happens when a family retreats too far from the world, letting its roots grow twisted in the dark. As the day wore on, Reynolds felt a quiet resolve settle in. Whatever the truth behind Jason Bowmont's life, whatever horrors had unfolded within those walls, the children now had a chance, however small, to live beyond them. The house would stand empty for years, its windows broken, its walls sagging further with every season. Locals would tell stories about it in hushed voices, warning strangers never to wander too close. But for Reynolds, that day in July would never fade. It was the day the swamp gave up its darkest secret. The day silence was finally broken. And it was only the first step toward uncovering the full story of the Bowmont family. He thought of the children, their faces pale in the morning light, and wondered how many of them would survive, how many would carry the weight of their father's choices for the rest of their lives. The answer would come later with time and study. But for now, all that remained was the memory of the house, the smell of damp wood and smoke, and the feeling of stepping into a place where time had stood still. Somewhere beyond the swamp, the world was waking up. The first cars passed along the highway, unaware of the nightmare that had been unearthed just miles away. For Reynolds, there was no going back to normal. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of distant birds fill the silence. The house might have been forgotten by time, but he knew it would not be forgotten by him. The story had only just begun. Long before Jason Bowmont stood in that doorway, the land itself had already shaped the fate of his bloodline. The swamps were both sanctuary and prison, holding the family in a kind of living exile. Jeremiah Bowmont arrived in Louisiana shortly after the Civil War, carrying secrets no one dared ask about. He was a gaunt man, hardened by life, who sought solitude more than opportunity. The swamp welcomed him like an accomplice. He built a small cabin on a dry patch of ground and planted enough corn to get by. Locals occasionally saw smoke from his chimney, but rarely saw the man himself. He kept to his land. When he did go into town, Jeremiah spoke little, buying only salt, nails, and ammunition. Men at the trading post said he had the look of someone who wanted the world to stay far away. Over time, whispers spread about him. Some said he had left Virginia because of trouble with the law. Others claimed darker reasons, muttering that he had broken family taboos no man should break. None dared ask to his face. It was in those years that Jeremiah's younger brother came to live with him, another silent figure who shared his distrust of outsiders. Together they expanded the cabin, making it a place meant to hold generations. The two men married into a distant branch of kin that lived upriver, bringing their wives to the swamp and cutting ties with nearly everyone else. From that moment, the Bowmont line began to coil inward on itself. By the 1890s, the family had become a curiosity to the parish. Rarely seen, they avoided church gatherings and community events, preferring to trade pelts and crops through intermediaries. The isolation deepened with each passing year. The children of that generation were taught that the world outside was dangerous. Men from neighboring farms who tried to befriend them were turned away. "Trust only blood," Jeremiah was said to repeat to his sons. When Jeremiah grew older, his grip on the family tightened. He performed his own ceremonies, quoting scripture to justify keeping the lineage pure. His sons obeyed, believing it was their duty to protect what he had built. By the time Theodore, Jason's father, was born, the Bowmont farm was a world unto itself. The boys hunted, fished, and grew crops, learning to survive without leaning on anyone beyond the swamp. Theodore was strong but quiet, a man who carried his father's beliefs like a second skin. He taught his sons that the outside world would only bring trouble and that men had to defend what was theirs. The few neighbors who ventured near often felt unwelcome. Stories spread of warning shots fired over the heads of trespassers. The Bowmonts guarded their land fiercely, as though it was all they had in the world. Over the years, death came and went quietly on the farm. Graves marked only by wooden crosses dotted the clearing. No priest blessed the ground, no congregation gathered, just a family keeping its secrets in the mud. When Theodore came of age, he followed the pattern set before him. He took a cousin as his wife, sealing the bloodline even closer. To him, it wasn't scandal. It was tradition, passed from father to son. This choice meant the family's genetic pool grew smaller with every generation. But to Theodore, it was strength, not weakness. He believed the Bowmont blood was something set apart, something the swamp itself had chosen. By the 1930s, the farm had grown into a cluster of shacks, smokehouses, and storage sheds. It was no longer just a cabin. It was a compound, a fortress of wood and earth that kept the family hidden. Visitors described an eerie quiet that hung over the place. Even the children seemed cautious, watching strangers with wide, suspicious eyes. Men said it felt like stepping into a settlement from another century. When Jason was born in 1932, he entered a world where outside voices were almost non-existent. His father and uncles taught him to trap, hunt, and farm, but they also taught him to see strangers as a threat. He grew up hearing stories about men from town who cheated, lied, and tried to take what wasn't theirs. These warnings became part of him, shaping the boy into a man who trusted no one beyond his family. The Great Depression barely touched the Bowmont farm. They lived off the land, their lives changing little as the world outside struggled. Jason learned that survival meant self-reliance, and that leaving the farm meant danger. In time, Theodore passed the farm to Jason, who accepted it with a quiet sense of destiny. He saw himself not just as a farmer, but as the keeper of a legacy that began with Jeremiah's first claim. Jason's brothers left early, unwilling to live under the weight of tradition. One joined a logging crew upriver, another found work near Baton Rouge. Jason stayed, rooted to the land like the cypress trees around him. Alone, he grew more withdrawn. The swamp became his companion, its still waters and endless droning insects filling the silence. He began writing in notebooks, just as Jeremiah had, scribbling thoughts about blood, strength, and destiny. The farm grew poorer as the years went on. The soil thinned, the tools rusted, and the house began to sag. But Jason refused to leave. He believed that abandoning the land would be betraying everything his fathers had built. Even as the world modernized, the Bowmont property seemed frozen in time. Men driving past on rare occasions said it looked abandoned, yet smoke still rose from the chimney, proof that someone kept the old place alive. By the 1950s, Jason had turned inward completely. He rarely went to town, trading pelts and grain through middlemen. When he did speak to outsiders, his words were clipped, his tone suspicious, as though every question was a trap. It was during this period that Jason's worldview hardened into something immovable. He told anyone who would listen, mostly his sons, that the outside world was corrupt and that their blood was all they could trust. When Thomas took control of the Holloway clan, the valley grew colder. His father's twisted theology turned into something worse, a reign of terror where fear and obedience were enforced by violence, not persuasion. Thomas suffered from uncontrollable rages. He would vanish into the woods for days, returning with eyes glassy and wild. His brothers learned to stay silent, to avoid his gaze, to move like ghosts in their own homes. When his temper flared, he smashed furniture, broke tools, even struck his own kin without warning. The valley rang with his shouts. His authority was no longer divine, it was raw, physical, undeniable force. And yet Thomas still preached. Standing by firelight, he declared the Holloway's chosen men, stronger than the world beyond the cliffs. He claimed their twisted children were proof they were leaving behind the weakness of ordinary men. His sermons grew stranger. He spoke of visions, of hearing voices from the woods telling him the family's suffering was holy, that each malformed child was a step toward some mysterious higher form. The others listened, frightened but enthralled. They had been raised on Jacob's warnings about the outside world. Now they heard Thomas say that their very blood was turning them into something more than human. The valley's rituals changed under Thomas. Offerings of animal blood became common. Nights of chanting around fires stretched until dawn. Brothers cut scars into their skin to show loyalty, leaving marks they would carry forever. The children grew up with these ceremonies. They saw nothing strange in them. The valley was the entire world, and Thomas was its prophet king, the man who spoke for the unseen powers watching them. But the genetic toll deepened. Infants were stillborn in alarming numbers. Some were born with twisted limbs or missing fingers. Others survived only hours, their hearts failing as their fathers watched in grim silence. Each death only drove Thomas further. He declared the graves holy ground, calling them offerings that would please the unseen spirits. He swore that soon the bloodline would be perfected through fire and pain. There was no longer any question of leaving. The valley was not just a home, but a prison built from fear, belief, and tradition. Any man who tried to escape simply disappeared forever. Thomas's punishments were legendary. One cousin who had tried to sneak out past the trail was found hanging from a tree, a crude warning to any others who dared think about running. The family stopped questioning anything. They worked the fields, repaired the cabins, and followed the prophet's orders without hesitation. Their language became stranger, their dialect a secret code no outsider could decipher anymore. By the 1880s, even nearby mountain men spoke of the Holloways as a separate people. They said their faces were long, their movements uncanny, their laughter hollow, like men who had forgotten how to be human. The valley took on an almost mythic presence. Hunters claimed they saw figures watching them from the cliffs, silent, motionless. No one dared venture near the pass after dark. It was said the place belonged to ghosts. But Thomas was not content. He wanted the bloodline tighter, purer. He ordered more unions between brothers and cousins, pairing them off according to his own visions. No one dared refuse him. The family tree became a closed loop, circling back on itself generation after generation. The children bore the weight of this decision in their very bones, their bodies carrying the marks of isolation. Some were born blind, others deaf, but Thomas claimed they were touched by spirits. He told the clan these sons could hear voices ordinary men could not, that they were proof of their sacred mission. The more twisted the births became, the louder Thomas preached. He promised them a time was coming when the bloodline would produce a perfect man, a prophet greater than himself, one who would lead them out. His mind was fraying. Sometimes he would sit for days without speaking, staring at the stone cliffs as if waiting for them to answer. When he spoke again, his voice was strange, distant, almost childlike. Despite his madness, the clan obeyed. They feared him, but they also believed him. He had become the living embodiment of the valley's will, a figure both terrifying and holy in their eyes. By the time Thomas grew old, the Holloways had become almost unrecognizable from the men who had first entered the valley. Their faces were narrow, their speech a guttural murmur, their rituals more elaborate than ever. Thomas died without ever leaving the valley. His grave was dug beside Jacob's. The stone marking it was carved with strange symbols only the Holloways understood, as if they were writing their own language now. After his death, leadership passed to his eldest surviving son, Abel. Where Thomas had been a tyrant, Abel was a dreamer, but a dreamer whose mind was cracked open by decades of inbreeding. Abel was impossibly tall and gaunt, his limbs spindly like branches, his face drawn and pale. His mind wavered between childlike simplicity and frightening intensity. He believed himself a prophet chosen by heaven. Under Abel, the rituals grew darker still. He preached that the deformities were not punishments, but signs of holiness, proof that they were evolving into something beyond the reach of ordinary mankind. The clan began cutting deeper scars into their skin, marking themselves with strange patterns. Abel told them these marks were gateways for spirits, signs that they were becoming vessels for divine purpose. He built altars of stone in the woods where sacrifices were made. Deer, foxes, even stray dogs were slaughtered under moonlight, their blood mixed with ash and smeared on the faces of Abel's followers. The valley felt cursed. The air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. The Holloways walked with slow, deliberate steps, speaking rarely, as though each man was listening for some voice only he could hear. Abel claimed he saw visions of fire sweeping across the outside world, leaving only the valley untouched. He told the clan they were destined to inherit the earth after its cleansing. The others believed him. There was no longer any outside world to them. The mountains were the edge of existence, the cliffs a wall between them and the dying, sinful nation beyond. Outsiders who came near vanished more frequently. Hunters whispered about finding bones arranged in patterns near the pass. No one wanted to know what message they were meant to send. Abel's followers chanted for hours by torchlight. The sound echoed through the valley like a hymn to something older than mankind. It was said you could hear them even from the ridges far away. The Holloway bloodline was no longer just a family. It had become a cult, a tribe, a closed circle with no exit. Every child born was a step closer to either redemption or extinction. And as Abel's visions grew more fevered as his body wasted away into near-skeleton thinness, he promised them the chosen child was coming, the one who would carry the bloodline to its final destiny. The men nodded silently, their eyes wide, believing every word. The valley waited, heavy with expectation, for the moment when prophecy and blood would finally converge and the Holloway curse would take its ultimate form. Morning in Devil's Hollow began with silence. No rooster crowed, no church bell rang. Men woke to the sound of their own breath, the weight of the valley pressing down like a second sky. Cabins were dark, their walls built from rough-hewn logs blackened by years of smoke. Thin chimneys coughed pale ribbons into the air, mixing with the mist that hung low and clung to the frozen ground. Fathers and sons stepped into the cold, their boots crunching against frost, their faces set like stone. Work was constant, endless. There were no idle days, no moments wasted on leisure or laughter. The fields were rocky and thin, carved into the earth by generations of hands. Men bent their backs under the weight of plows fashioned from scavenged iron, their breaths coming in visible clouds in the morning light. Hunting parties ranged the ridges, their steps soundless on the moss. They knew every trail, every hollow tree, every place where deer came to drink. Silence was their weapon, the forest their uneasy ally. Meals were sparse, built from what could be grown, trapped or cured over smoky fires. Salt pork, beans, coarse bread, survival food meant to fill bellies, not to comfort or delight. Boys learned early that the valley had rules. Step out of line, speak when not spoken to, refuse a command. Punishment came swiftly, without warning. The cliffs kept them in as surely as walls. Evenings were worse. When night fell, the valley became a shadowed bowl, where torchlight flickered and voices carried strangely. Fires cast long shapes against the trees, turning every man into a looming figure. Rituals were performed by firelight. The prophet spoke in a trembling voice, his words washing over the gathering like smoke. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on him, as though hypnotized. Chants filled the darkness, low and rhythmic, vibrating in the bones. Ash and blood were smeared on foreheads. The smell of burned offerings clung to the air, bitter and heavy, marking every ritual night. There was no laughter, no music, no stories beyond the prophet's own. Children grew up without knowing songs of joy. Their lullabies were whispered prayers for strength and survival. Births were a matter of grim duty. Men gathered outside while a midwife worked inside. When a baby cried, relief came like a breath. When silence followed, a grave was dug before dawn. Graves dotted the hillsides, marked with stones scratched by rough hands. Some bore names. Others were left blank, as though the valley itself wanted to swallow its dead and keep their memory locked away. Fathers dug for their sons, brothers for their brothers, burying them in frozen soil with shovels and calloused hands. Death was constant, but mourning was quiet, almost forbidden, as though grief would anger the valley. The boys who survived became hard early. They were taught to trap, to cut wood, to track by smell and sound. Weakness was punished, not pitied. The valley had no use for softness. By adolescence, they were initiated into the rituals. Scars were cut into their arms as proof of belonging. Blood was let into the dirt, the ground drinking it greedily as if it demanded payment. The prophet watched over every ceremony. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the fire. His words were fevered, promising salvation through pain, through obedience, through the keeping of the bloodline. Every man carried the weight of the family's law. They were told the outside world was cursed, full of liars and demons. To leave was to betray everything, to condemn your soul. The outside world became a story, a rumor. Boys whispered about the towns beyond the cliffs, imagining strange machines, paved roads, glowing lamps. But no one dared speak of leaving aloud. As seasons turned, the valley seemed to shrink. The cabins pressed closer, the fields felt smaller, the mountains heavier. It was as though the world itself was closing in around them. Winters were brutal. Snow trapped them for weeks, cutting off even the narrow pass. Fires burned day and night, woodpiles vanishing quickly. Men's beards grew thick with frost, their fingers cracked and bleeding. Disease swept through the cabins like a silent hunter. Coughs turned into rattles, fevers into stillness. The prophet declared it a test from above, a cleansing of the weak from their sacred line. Boys watched their brothers carried out into the snow, their faces pale against the cold. By spring, new graves rose like teeth from the hillsides, grim reminders of the winter's hunger and sickness. Through it all, the prophet's hold grew stronger. Each tragedy became a sermon, each death a sign that the valley was chosen. Men clung to this belief because there was nothing else left. Even their language began to change. Words twisted, old syllables merging into strange guttural sounds until outsiders could barely understand them. It was as if the valley was teaching them to speak in its own voice. The forest became both sanctuary and threat. At night, men swore they heard whispers among the trees, voices calling them by name. The prophet said these were spirits guiding them toward the future. Every man knew his place. Hunters hunted, farmers farmed, guards kept watch at the pass. The valley was an organism, each member a piece of its body, working in grim harmony. No one questioned the rituals anymore. When the prophet demanded blood offerings, they obeyed. When he called for unions between cousins, they complied. Obedience was survival, and survival was the only law left. Fear ruled quietly. There were no shackles, no locked doors. The mountains themselves were the cage, and the prophet's voice was the key that kept the gate forever closed. Outsiders rarely appeared, and when they did, they rarely left. Their tools, guns, and coats sometimes appeared in the cabins weeks later, mute evidence of their fate, but no one dared ask questions. Children born during these years rarely smiled. Their faces seemed too old for their small bodies, their eyes dark and watchful. They played in silence, their games imitations of hunting and burial. At night, the valley glowed with firelight. The chants rose like a heartbeat under the stars, steady and relentless. It was as if the mountains themselves were breathing with them, keeping time with their faith. The prophet promised that their suffering would not be forever. He told them a day would come when a perfect son would be born, one who would carry them into a new world. Every man waited for that day. Each birth watched with anxious hope. Each time another twisted, sickly child appeared, the prophet said the perfect one was closer, that they must endure a little longer. Years blurred together. The valley changed little. Cabins rotted and were rebuilt. Graves filled and new ones were dug. The same chants echoed off the cliffs, binding generation after generation to the same fate. By the time the 20th century began, the Holloways were a breed apart. No census had counted them. No preacher had seen them. The valley was their entire reality, and they were its prisoners. Life in Devil's Hollow was not just survival. It was a slow, ritualistic march toward something inevitable. Each day, each birth, each death drew them closer to the final chapter none of them could escape. The intervention on the Bowmont property began at dawn. Deputies arrived with additional vehicles, their tires sinking into the wet earth. The swamp was quiet except for the distant croak of frogs, as if nature anticipated confrontation. Jason stood on the porch when they arrived, a solitary figure glaring at the approaching convoy. His rifle hung by the door, untouched, though his posture made it clear he was ready to fight if necessary. Deputy Reynolds stepped forward, reading the court order aloud. Each word seemed to hang heavy in the air. Jason's face was stone, but a muscle in his jaw twitched with each sentence. The deputies spread out across the clearing, careful and deliberate. Some approached the house while others positioned themselves at the tree line, watching for movement. The property felt like a powder keg ready to ignite. When Reynolds ordered the children brought outside, there was a long pause. Jason finally nodded toward the doorway. One by one, the boys stepped out, blinking in the morning light, their faces pale and unreadable. The deputies worked quickly, escorting them to waiting vehicles. Some of the boys resisted, clinging to the door frames, but they were gently pried free and led across the muddy yard toward the trucks. Jason's anger boiled over when the youngest were carried out. He shouted warnings, calling the deputies thieves, traitors, destroyers of his work. His words echoed across the swamp, carried on the humid air like a curse. Reynolds kept his voice calm, repeating that this was for the children's safety. Jason spat in the mud, his fury barely contained, but he did not resist when he was finally handcuffed. Inside the house, deputies found the notebooks that would become key evidence. Page after page detailed Jason's thoughts about bloodlines, purity, and destiny, each entry more obsessive than the last, revealing a mind spiraling into fanaticism. The boys were loaded into the trucks, some crying softly, others staring in silence. Their fear was palpable, but there was a strange relief in their faces, as if they sensed something was finally ending. The convoy pulled away from the property, leaving the house standing empty for the first time in decades. The mist clung to the sagging roof, giving it the look of a mausoleum left behind. Back in town, the children were taken to a temporary shelter. Doctors and social workers worked through the day, examining each boy, cataloging injuries, deformities, and illnesses that had gone untreated for years. Reynolds watched as physicians shook their heads over twisted limbs, malnourished bodies, and infections. The list of medical issues grew longer by the hour, painting a picture of generations neglected in isolation. Reporters soon descended on the parish, drawn by rumors of a hidden family discovered deep in the swamp. Their questions were relentless, but authorities kept details quiet until every child had been safely examined. The case began to attract statewide attention. Headlines spoke of the swamp compound, the secret family, and the man who defied the world. The Bowmont name became synonymous with secrecy and tragedy. Jason was booked into the parish jail under heavy guard. He spoke little during processing, refusing food at first, and staring through the bars as if the walls of the cell were less confining than the outside world. When interrogators asked him about the children, he simply repeated that they were his, that no one had the right to take them. His voice carried no remorse, only defiance, as though he still ruled the farm. In the shelter, the boys were given clean clothes and hot food. Some ate ravenously. Others, too weak to lift a spoon, were fed by hand. Slowly, color returned to their faces as days passed. Social workers noted how they clung to one another, rarely leaving each other's side. Years of isolation had made them depend on one another more than most siblings. Their bond was both a comfort and a reminder of the past. Psychologists were brought in to assess them. They spoke gently, coaxing words from boys who had rarely spoken to anyone outside their family. Progress was slow but steady as trust began to form. Reynolds visited the shelter several times, standing at the doorway to watch. The boys' fear had softened into curiosity. Some even smiled at him, tentative but genuine, a small sign of the weight lifting. In court, Jason's first appearance drew a packed gallery. Men from neighboring towns came to see the man who had kept a family locked away for decades. Jason met their stares with cold indifference. The judge ordered a full investigation into the children's conditions, summoning experts from universities to study the genetic damage caused by generations of isolation. Scientists arrived, notebooks in hand, treating the family like a case study. Their findings shocked even seasoned professionals. The degree of genetic similarity among the boys was extreme, leading to rare disorders seldom seen outside medical journals. Each discovery added another layer to the tragedy. Jason's trial was scheduled for the following spring. Until then, he remained in jail, writing in his cell, filling new notebooks with declarations that he had been chosen, that the world had stolen his sons. Meanwhile, the boys were placed in long-term care facilities. They received surgeries, therapy, and education for the first time. The road ahead was difficult, but for the first time they were given a chance to grow beyond the swamp. Reporters eventually gained permission to visit the property, documenting the decaying house and overgrown fields. Photographs of the place ran in newspapers, shocking readers with how primitive life had been just miles from modern highways. The parish organized efforts to dismantle the remaining structures, citing safety concerns. By winter, the house stood gutted, its windows boarded, its roof collapsing. Soon the swamp would reclaim what had been taken from it. Reynolds drove past one last time before the demolition began. The clearing was quiet, the air heavy, as though even the land mourned the end of something that had stood for generations. He parked and stood by the gate, remembering the first day he walked through. The house no longer frightened him, but it left a hollow ache, a sense of something broken that could never be made whole. Back in town, the case remained on everyone's lips. Men at the bar argued about whether Jason was evil or simply a product of his isolation. Either way, none could deny the damage he had done. As winter gave way to spring, the parish prepared for trial. Witness lists were drawn up, evidence cataloged, experts summoned. The weight of decades would soon be laid bare before judge and jury. The boys continued their slow transformation. Some learned to read and write, others began to speak freely for the first time. Their progress became a small beacon of hope amid the grim details of the case. But even as progress was made, the past hung over them like a storm cloud. Every cough, every scar, every memory tied them to the clearing where they had spent their entire lives. The silence of the swamp had been broken, but the echoes of what happened there would take years to fade. For now, the world watched, waiting to see how justice would weigh the life of Jason Bowmont. The stage was set for the trial that would expose every secret, every page of those notebooks, and force the parish and the state to confront how such a tragedy had remained hidden for so long. The trial of Jason Bowmont began in a packed courthouse, the air heavy with anticipation. Men from across the parish gathered to witness the conclusion of a story that had haunted them since the discovery. Jason sat expressionless at the defense table, his hair longer now, his beard streaked with gray. He refused to look at the gallery, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor as the charges were read. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision. The notebooks, the medical reports, the testimony of deputies and doctors. Each piece painted a picture of a man consumed by belief, blind to the harm he caused. Witnesses described the house, the smell of damp wood, the silence of the children. Reynolds testified, his voice steady, recounting the day he first walked through the gate and saw the faces staring back at him. Experts took the stand, explaining the genetic damage caused by generations of isolation. Charts and diagrams were shown to the jury, revealing how the family tree had folded in on itself until tragedy became inevitable. Jason's defense argued that he was shaped by the swamp, by the teachings of his father and grandfather, by decades of isolation. They claimed he believed he was protecting his family, not destroying it. But the jury saw the ledgers, read the pages where Jason wrote about keeping the blood pure. They heard his own words, recorded after arrest, saying he would have done it all again. After days of testimony, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Jason stood as the sentence was read, life without parole. He showed no visible reaction, as though the outcome had been expected. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Headlines the next morning declared the end of the Bowmont reign. Yet for many, the trial felt less like an ending and more like the closing of one grim chapter. In the years that followed, the children became the focus. They were placed in specialized care, receiving medical treatment and education. Some thrived, others struggled, but all were given a chance to live beyond the swamp. Doctors published papers on the case, detailing rare conditions found among the boys. Geneticists used the data to better understand hereditary disease, turning a tragedy into knowledge that might prevent future suffering. Sociologists visited the parish, studying how a family could remain hidden for so long. They interviewed locals who admitted they had known something was wrong, but chose to stay silent rather than interfere. The property itself did not survive. A fire consumed the house a few years later, leaving only charred timbers and rusted farm tools. Some said the blaze was an accident, others whispered it was an attempt to erase the past. By the 1980s, the clearing was overgrown again, the swamp reclaiming the land. Cypress trees rose where the cornfields once stood. The fence collapsed, its boards sinking into the mud like the bones of a long-buried creature. Jason remained in prison, a quiet figure who kept mostly to himself. Guards reported that he continued to write, filling notebooks with the same words about destiny and purity he had written his entire life. He died behind bars in 1989. His body returned to the parish for burial in an unmarked grave. Only a handful of men attended, standing in silence as the earth covered the last Bowmont patriarch. For the boys, adulthood brought mixed fates. Some found work and built quiet lives. Others struggled with health issues that followed them into maturity. A few never fully recovered from the psychological weight of their upbringing. One of the youngest grew into an advocate for children in isolated communities. He spoke publicly about the dangers of neglect, urging authorities never to ignore warning signs that might hide behind closed doors. His speeches became a rallying cry for reform. Lawmakers introduced new measures to monitor remote homesteads, ensuring access to education and health care. The Bowmont case became a cornerstone in discussions of rural social policy. Universities continued to study the genetic data for decades, citing it as one of the most extreme documented cases of endogamy. Students read about the family as a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses. The parish slowly moved on, though the story was retold in bars and around campfires. Men pointed toward the swamp and said that some ghosts never left, that you could still feel the weight of what had happened. Reynolds, now older, sometimes drove past the overgrown road leading to where the house once stood. He would stop, step out, and listen to the swamp, hearing only frogs and wind where once there had been silence. He never forgot the faces of the boys that day, pale, frightened, and yet somehow defiant. To him, their rescue had been the most important work of his career, a reminder of why he wore the badge. The legacy of Jason Bowmont became more than a local story. It became a study in how isolation can twist a family, how belief without question can grow into something dangerous when left unchecked for too long. Historians debated whether Jason was villain or victim, whether he had been doomed from birth by the choices of his fathers. The truth, they said, was somewhere in between, a tragedy written over generations. For the surviving sons, the world outside was both liberator and tormentor. It gave them freedom, but also forced them to face the weight of their past. Some embraced it, others withdrew into quiet lives. Even decades later, men who had been there during the intervention said the memory still woke them at night. The smell of the house, the sound of boots on wet floorboards, those details never faded. The parish kept a few artifacts in storage: Jason's notebooks, a few tools, a piece of the fence. They were reminders that what happened there was real, not just a tale told to scare travelers. As time passed, the swamp swallowed nearly every trace of the property. Only those who had been there could point to the exact spot, standing among the trees where a house once held 17 lives captive. In the end, the Bowmont story became a warning, not just about genetic danger, but about what can grow in darkness when no one looks too closely. It reminded men of the cost of silence. Each anniversary of the intervention, Reynolds would sit on his porch, thinking of that morning. He felt pride that the boys had been saved, but sorrow that they had needed saving at all. The case was taught to new deputies as an example of vigilance, that a single anonymous complaint can uncover a hidden world, that courage is sometimes just knocking on a door when no one else will. The swamp remained quiet, but its stillness no longer held the same menace. It had given up its secret, and in doing so, allowed the parish to breathe again, to let light back into a place that had been too long in shadow. And so the legacy of the Bowmonts lived on, not as a house, not as a family line, but as a lesson carved deep into the memory of Louisiana, warning that no man's world should ever grow so small again.